I wanted to try to speak directly to the theme of a broader Asian encounter and the movement of knowledge between Russia and its various Easts and the Easts beyond. And it struck me as a very useful frame to focus on this figure, Bichurin, who I'll tell you about in a moment. But I wanted to start with Pushkin, because Pushkin's always interesting. So, I want you to travel back in time to 1830. It's January, St. Petersburg. It's cold. Our beloved poet, he's 30 years old. He's had some ups and downs, including falling in love with Natalia Goncharova, only to have his interest rebuffed by her mother, who doesn't think that he's appropriately matched. He was devastated. He took off for a year to the Caucasus to serve under General Bashkevich. He's come back. He wrote his journey to Erzurum based on that. Moody time. He's still moody. He's still restless. He's looking for something to distract him. Now, things are going to get better, at least in the short term. Natalia is going to bend towards his entreaties, and more importantly, her family is going to approve. So the boy will get the girl. But the problem is, he doesn't know this yet, Pushkin. So on January 7th, 1830, during a trip to St. Petersburg, he writes to General Alexander Beckendorf, the head of the 3rd section, and his personal minder. He writes in French, of course. And after some entreaties in which he apologizes for not having found the general at home, he quickly gets to the matter at hand. He says, "Given that I am at present neither married," and that must have hurt him to write this, "given that at present I am neither married nor engaged in state service, I would desire to make a journey, either to France or Italy. But if this were not to be granted to me, I would then request permission to visit China, along with the mission that's about to render itself there." Pushkin then hears back from Beckendorf 10 days later. "Sir, in response to your letter, I hasten to inform you that His Majesty the Emperor did not deem it possible to accede to your request for permission to travel abroad, fearing the distress that this would cause to your finances." So Tsar Nicholas was concerned about Pushkin's pocket, while also distracting you from your activities. "Your desire to accompany our mission to China likewise cannot be granted, because all the members of the mission have already been assigned, and no changes are allowed without prior notification to the court in Peking." What Beckendorf didn't say in his letter is that the government didn't want Pushkin going to Europe for fear that he wouldn't come back, which was plausible. And they didn't want him going to China because on the way he would surely meet his Decembrist friends in Siberia. So that's it. Niet. Simple niet. Seized with the possibility of traveling to China and with an embassy right there in St. Petersburg waiting to take him, our beloved Russian poet has his hopes cruelly dashed by the merciless Iron Tsar and his equally merciless gendarme-in-chief. Just think of what Pushkin could have told us about China, about the Great Wall, about the Forbidden City, about those camel caravans crossing the Gobi. Kak žal. At least this is the regret that we hear in the comments of many of Pushkin's supporters, beginning later in the 19th century and continuing to today. But regardless of how sorry we might feel about Pushkin, this seems like a good vignette to lead off some reflections about Russia's relationship with China and even more broader Asia during Tsarist times. Because Pushkin does a number of useful things for us, I think, as thinkers on these questions in this little episode. First, he wants to go to China, but he doesn't actually go. That's a reminder of the fact that much of Russia's mental interaction with China took place without, in fact, traveling to the country or knowing much about it. Secondly, Pushkin most wanted to go to either France or Italy, with China coming after that, which reminds us that much of the Russian elite's interest in and imagining of China often existed in a kind of tension with their attachments to Europe. Not to mention the simple fact that Pushkin could, in fact, in one letter, imagine going in two directions. West to Europe, east to Asia, reflecting the fact that Russia was, of course, positioned between the both of them. Pushkin had a multi-directed or multi-directionness to his wanderlust, in part because the Russian Empire was positioned to take you in a variety of directions. And thirdly, importantly too, Pushkin pinned his hopes on getting to China on a Russian mission that was about to go there. And so in that respect, he basically cast his lot with a formal state institution. And that's a reminder of the very important role that the state plays in bringing knowledge of China and broader Asia to the attention of educated Russians in Tsarist times. But perhaps most importantly, fundamentally, Pushkin's story of a trip that never happened is a reminder that for most Russians going to China, going to Asia more generally, what they had to do first was indeed take a journey. And this journey could be long, difficult, it could be life-threatening. Some of these journeys could be much shorter, much easier. But almost always some kind of relocation was involved. And in this sense, a journey is a very useful metaphor for thinking about the whole experience of the Russian engagement with Asia, including the specific issues of Wissentransfer that we're engaging with in our meeting. When we talk about the circulation and production of knowledge that was a part of Russia's historical relationship with Asian societies, what we're really talking about in concrete terms is the hard reality of people, ideas, behaviors, technologies, institutions, and goods moving out of one context and into another, and then often coming back again, with all the complexities of relocation and adaptation that are a part of any journey, including the moments of frustration, confusion, and actual joy that a number of us, I'm sure, experienced yesterday getting here through the railroad strike, which I'll at least put myself into that category where my hopes were dashed when my first train was canceled, and then excited when the next one wasn't, and then obviously I was deeply relieved when I arrived. So all of those elements are a part of journeying, and they were surely writ large into a Russian experience of understanding or trying to understand Asia as well. In my talk, what I want to do is offer some reflections on Russia's journeying back and forth to Asia in the Tsarist era, in particular in the 18th and 19th century. It's a huge topic. It's way too big for a single talk, so that means I'm going to leave many interesting things out, and I'll treat everything else much too briefly. But what I wanted to do was focus on one professional Russian knowledge circulator, and by extension, a journeyer, a tour guide to the problem. And that's this man, Nikita Yakovlevich Bichurin, who is a deacon's son from Kazan province, who became a monk. And as a function of becoming a monk, he assumed a religious name, Yakimov in Russian, or Hyacinth in English. And because of this, he's known, in fact, by these two names, Bichurin and Yakimov, or in some cases, Отец or father, Yakimov. Though it was a very unusual and unlikely achievement given his origins, given where he came from, by the time of his death in 1853, Bichurin was without a doubt his country's foremost authority on Chinese civilization. So he knew Chinese, spoken Mandarin, and obviously he could read Chinese extensively. He knew Manchu. He dressed in Chinese robes. He translated numerous Chinese texts and drew or recopied Chinese maps for Russian audiences, like this map of Lhasa. He won Russia's most prestigious book prize on 3 occasions. He founded a school to teach Chinese to Russian and Buryat boys in the Sino-Russian border town of Kyakhta, and he lived for almost 14 years in Beijing as the head of the Russian spiritual mission in the city. A reviewer in Sin Отечество, which is an influential journal of his time, described him in 1840 as, quote, our esteemed sinologist who is famous throughout Europe for casting new light on the study of China. And this last point is a reference to the fact that Bichurin was also an elected member of academic societies in France and Britain. In ethnic terms, he was a Chuvash, descended from a Novokreshenny Chuvash family that converted to Orthodoxy in the mid-18th century. And so in addition to his other attributes, Soviet and more recently post-Soviet writers from Chuvashia have proudly laid claim to him as one of the most famous sons of the Chuvash people. In fact, that's always mentioned in any Chuvash writing about him. His career accomplishments, are just written here. This is an image just reminding you of his vaunted status even in Russia today, where he gets himself written into a series on the country's most glorious sons. One should also add, though, that he had a very colorful personality, and he had a checkered career in the church, including achieving, I guess, the rare distinction of being defrocked by the Holy Synod for immoral behavior and graft during the period of his mission in Beijing. So in other words, stripped of his monkly standing. For a time, this actually led to his imprisonment on Valam Island, Lake Ladoga. Though ultimately, thanks to the interventions of well-connected friends, he was pardoned and allowed to be reinstated as a monk and live in St. Petersburg. For almost the last 30 years of his life, from the mid-1820s to the early 1850s, for most of that period, except when he was away in eastern Siberia, his residence was a monk's cell at the Alexander Nevsky Lavra in St. Petersburg. But his day job was in the city, working as a translator for the Asiatic department at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Because of Bichurin's notorious side and his unusual expertise, he's China expert, and his slightly unorthodox appearance, he was a very tall man, for the time anyway. He had apparently, by most people, described in a very intense manner and gaze. And he was known for dressing in Chinese robes, which even for cosmopolitan St. Petersburg was a little rare. So he was very well known in the capital, with many contacts in government and intelligentsia circles, including Pushkin. In fact, the mission that Pushkin was trying to join in 1830 was a mission that included Bichurin. And it's possible that Pushkin found out about the mission from Bichurin himself. It's possible, though, of course, that he found out in other ways. Bichurin and Pushkin moved within circuits of very well-positioned people in the capital, and they reportedly first met at a dinner party chez the Karamzins. So that's proof that they were talking to interesting and influential individuals. This painting from mid-1990s by a Chuvash artist is clearly evoking, an important association for the son of the Chuvash people. In all, Bichurin undertook 3 China-oriented journeys. One to Beijing to serve as head of the 9th Spiritual Mission in 1808, and he stayed there until 1821. And then 2 more to the edge of the Qing Empire at Kyakhta in the 1830s. In each case, he went out and he came back. So in that sense, he was indeed a circulator. And so in following him, we can see some of the physical and mental operations that are part of the circulating business. And in taking Bichurin as a guide to these questions of Russian engagement with Asia, I wanted to focus on 3 broad questions and sort of put Bichurin's life into the middle of them and see to that degree what his experience can tell us about broader realities. First, I want to think out loud with you about the kinds of Russians or Russian subjects that acquired and brought back knowledge of Asia. And so who really are the agents of this history that we're trying to write? Secondly, I wanted to think with you about the sites and the sources of the knowledge that's being obtained and circulated, disseminated. In a practical sense, where did these Russian subjects do their knowledge making and their knowledge sharing of Asia? And what generalizations can we make about the modes and the pathways of the knowledge that's a part of the story? That is, how did this knowledge move and how was it organized? Our papers, I think, are showing us many of the details of these processes, but are there some general rules that we can try to form to make sense of the bigger picture, at least for the imperial era? My sense is that Bichurin's life is useful in that respect. I mean, he's just one person. We shouldn't make too much of some of his exceptionalisms, but he does speak to broader realities, and sometimes getting down to this personal scale is helpful for seeing much bigger truths. And then at the very end, what I hope to do is to use Bichurin's case to answer an even broader question, one that hasn't much come up yet in our discussions, but it seems like the obvious one to ask at some point and to think about perhaps even more than anything. For all the knowledge that's going back and forth, for all the circulating of interesting and influential people, did any of this knowledge transfer and cross-cultural learning produce something more than knowledge? I mean, did it produce understanding? I think Bichurin's life can help us think about that. In some respects, he seems to have been an impossibly learned man, but also limited by some barriers to full understanding. Okay, so let me take these questions one by one, and then look forward to discussion with you. First of all, what kinds of Russians are engaged in this knowledge transfer? What kinds of Russians, in effect, are going to Asia? Thinking in terms of occupation, we can identify a long list of types. So Bichurin was a churchman. He was schooled from the age of 8 at what became the Kazan Spiritual Academy, which in time would become a center of Oriental studies and missionary training within the Orthodox Church. At the age of 22, he completed his formal education. A year later, he became a monk. But over the long course of his life, we see him occupy a number of professional niches, professional hats that he puts on. School principal, institute director, amateur scholar, translator, teacher. His example reminds us that professionals of all these types served in the ranks of the Russians who knew Asia, and that any number of these individuals actually could and did wear different hats at the same time. But there are many more occupations that we can identify as being associated with kind of churning up knowledge of Asia. And here I think it pays to be as broad and inclusive as we can in thinking about the knowledge retrieval process, I guess. We can put on this list diplomats, military officers, ship captains, revolutionary exiles, pilgrims. We can put on the list formally trained scholars and amateurs, to use the term again. We can include merchants, wagon drivers, soldiers, sailors, peasant colonists, tourists, including royal tourists like Nicholas II, whose example was mentioned earlier today, the first and last Tsar to visit South and East Asia, who sailed to these destinations as Tsarevich in 1890, and then came back overland to Petersburg from Vladivostok. These Russian Asian voyagers were high-born and low. Nobles and royals and members of Russian educated society tend to take most of the oxygen in the room when we start talking about these things. But we miss the complexity of what's going on in terms of knowledge transfer with Asian societies if we leave out the larger cast of characters. And it's useful even to just remember Nicholas's example. If he got on steamships and sailed through the Black Sea, Eastern Mediterranean, Suez, around India, through the Indian Ocean, and into ultimately the Sea of China and the Sea of Japan, he was being shadowed at the same time by steamships taking Russian peasant colonists and Cossacks on a similar maritime journey. And they too, some of them, left their records of this great Asian relocation. And when you find the letters of peasants traveling in the 1880s on this great maritime relay, letters that were reprinted by Zemstvos to speak to the vivaciousness and the sort of compelling qualities of peasant life, what you find in their letters, in some cases, are very elaborate descriptions of these eastern ports and landscapes, eastern peoples. They can be, in fact, quite poetic. Nothing less than, in many respects, the documents written by people who are much more formally educated. You certainly feel the same degree of excitement and wonder that was a part of their discovery. It's also very important to recognize, even though we haven't addressed it so much in our meeting to date, is that many of the Russians who engaged with Asia were not Russians in an ethnic sense. So the story of engagement with Asia is an imperial story rather than a national or ethnically Russian one. It's a story of the many peoples of the empire as well as long resident foreigners. Swedish POWs captured in Peter's time, who ultimately helped to translate the cultures of Siberia for a Russian audience. Baltic German nobles, we've heard of a few of them so far. At least one Danish sea captain, Vitus Bering. Buryat pilgrims who crossed into the Qing Empire to visit the temples of Urga in Chinese Outer Mongolia, or Volga Tatar Hajis who made the pilgrimage to Mecca, or the Kazakh officer, scholar, explorer Shokhan Valikhanov, who was much extolled in his time in the mid-19th century as the first European to visit Kashgar, which he did in 1858 by changing out of his military uniform, Russian military uniform, with his epaulets and buttons and gold collars, and putting on the robes of a Central Asian merchant and shaving his head. So Bichurin here too is a useful reminder of the imperial dimension of the story. He was Chuvash, so a native of a Turkic, a member of a Turkic people, sort of indigenous to the Middle Volga region. As a boy, he spoke Chuvash in his mixed Russian Chuvash Orthodox village, and he probably first heard the word Asia in Kazan, which was in his time a mixed Orthodox and Muslim city, sort of the site of the first prominent Muscovite advance into the world of Islam in the 16th century. And by Bichurin's time, it was a city that was held up as the same kind of window on the outside world that St. Petersburg was. St. Petersburg's window faced west, and Kazan was the empire's window to the east. I mean, it's almost too obvious to note, but as all of this just underscores, the Russian subjects who made their journeys to Asia in the Tsarist age, they were both Europeans and Asians, or they included both. And the Asia they were journeying to, in some cases, was already home, or it was at least very close to being home. Because, obviously, one of the profoundly important aspects of the Russian engagement with Asia is that, as we've already started thinking about in our discussions, there was a world of Asia within the empire that the Russians and non-Russian subjects associating themselves with the power of the Tsar could see as their own. And then there was another Asia beyond the borders of the empire, and Russian subjects engaged with both. So what about the sites and the sources of Asian learning, the workshops, the tools that were used to develop and distribute this knowledge? Here too, I guess I'd side with the broadest possible view in answering the question. The most obvious sites are the ones that come up all the time and that are a part of already a very rich and established historiography on Russian Asian learning. These are the sites that we could instinctively sort of rattle off. Russian and European universities, the Academy of Sciences, the Kunstkamera, the Romanovs' palaces with their refined rooms of chinoiserie and their Turkish-style baths, Embassies and consulates were obviously places where knowledge of Asia was formed. Russian scholarly societies, like the Russian Geographic Society and its various regional branches. Trade commissions, we've already begun talking about. The Kazan Spiritual Academy, obviously, where Bichurin received his schooling. And the Russian Spiritual Mission in Beijing, where he served as director, and which, among other things, included a school. This is a very widely sort of reproduced drawing of the Russian Spiritual Mission as it appeared in the early 1850s. It included a small school for teaching Chinese converts Russian, but also an equally small school, really effectively a pavilion, for teaching Russian priests Chinese and, in the case of some, Manchu as well. And Bichurin was known as very adamant in his insistence that the priests under his directorship learn Chinese, and his correspondence with the authorities over him back in Russia often included complaints about the priests under his watch, complaints that they weren't dedicated enough in their learning of Chinese, and that they often gave up, which then led to certain problems with his mission, including lackadaisical behavior on the part of the priests, excessive drinking, womanizing, and other things that ultimately helped to undermine his reputation, and that led to later problems for him when he got home. The other obvious center of Asian learning that's come up a little bit too so far, and it's worth mentioning again, are all the military forms and centers. The army colleges of the 18th century, later the general staff, the navy, all of which collected information on Asia in preparation for and following the Russian conquests and annexations of the imperial era, from Peter's Persian campaign to the Crimea, the Amur, Tashkent, Göktepe, anti-Boxer campaign, the Russo-Japanese War, and so on. I mean, Russia, I think it just has to be constantly made alive in the way we speak about this complex problem of transfer of knowledge and understanding, to a degree, of Asia in the imperial period. Is Russia's Asia was actually profoundly changing throughout this period, since Russia was an expanding Asian power. In fact, its great expansion was overwhelmingly at the expense of Asian societies in the 18th and 19th centuries. So the army was, and the navy to a lesser degree, were at the center of this expansion, and consequently they were at the center of the learning that was involved in both setting up expansion and then digesting it. But I would say that there are less well-defined sites of Asian knowledge that we should also put on the list, and that sort of speak to concerns that Andreas mentioned as he introduced the seminar today. What is the knowledge we're looking for? And depending on how we define that knowledge, we can open up numerous different sites of inquiry, including bazaars, like you mentioned. And if I were to make a list like this, I would include certain kinds of settings, like Eastern-oriented ports, Odessa, Astrakhan, Vladivostok, the Great Siberian Road, the Sibirsky Tract, which was absolutely critical to relaying information and understanding about Asia to Russia, and obviously Russian influence into Asia. The defensive lines that ran along the undefined southern edges of the empire in the Caucasus, southern Siberia, Central Asia, and also river systems like the Volga and the Amur, which, in addition to playing the role that they had in commerce or defense, which is the way they're usually sort of placed into our historical narratives, they should also be seen as lanes of learning, sort of conduits that allowed for the movement of information and the transferring of learned habits, which is also, I would argue, a form of knowledge. Learned habits of cross-cultural communication and adaptation. Just like the sites of Russian learning, the sources of the learning were incredibly diverse. Russian investigators studied Asian maps, and they commissioned their own maps. They sent out explorers. They collected artifacts and samples. They studied laws. They intercepted letters from Asian emissaries. They stole reports on Asian lands from their European rivals. Bichurin is an example of a Russian-Asian interlocutor whose principal scholarly representation of China was drawn entirely from Chinese sources. Overwhelmingly from Chinese sources. One of his great achievements of sinological scholarship was a massive 9-volume Russian-Chinese dictionary, which he based largely on the Kangxi dictionary, which he first consulted in Beijing, and a number of publications on Chinese history, geography, and law that were based virtually exclusively on the materials of the Great Qing legal code, the Da Qing Lü Li. When Bichurin left the Chinese capital, like all true intellectual plunderers, he took a lot of material with him. By the accounts of his contemporaries, some of whom were inclined to exaggerate, he supposedly came home with tens of crates of Chinese books and rarities, shipping them back to St. Petersburg by camel caravan. And we know for a fact that by the end of his life, or close to the end of his life, he gifted close to 300 Chinese books, maps, and manuscripts to Kazan University, which helped to further consolidate the university's emerging preeminence as a locus of study of Asian societies. A faculty for the study of Chinese and Manchu had opened there in the 1830s, and Bichurin was responding to this and hoping to seed gathering interest in that area of study. But, and this is an important thing to underscore, Bichurin did not just study China through Chinese texts. And this brings me to the last question, this question about modes and pathways of knowledge about Asia in the imperial era. If we want to draw the biggest possible picture of the activity that's going on, I think we want to identify two very important tensions that are a part of the way knowledge is being formed and moving in the sort of Russian-Asian frame. The first of these tensions is between European knowledge, on the one hand, and the knowledge obtained from what is supposedly a much more direct encounter with Asia. And the other tension is between an increasingly systemized, often very institutionalized, and formally approved or sort of sanctioned, I guess I'd call official knowledge, that ultimately takes the form of multiple disciplines of inquiry, all the disciplines that we know from the 19th century. In particular, Oriental studies, kind of umbrella discipline. That sort of official knowledge, on the one hand, is in tension with another kind of knowledge that didn't really fit into thick journals or official reports, that one might call lived knowledge, the knowledge of the resident. And I think Bichurin tells us a little bit about both of these tensions and makes us think about why they would be a productive part of any inquiry into these this big issue of Russian-Asian knowledge transfer. Let's think about the first tension between European knowledge on the one hand and direct Russian engagement with Asia and the knowledge that comes from that on the other. It's useful just to remember one famous quote, which I'm going to have to paraphrase because I actually can't remember the quote exactly, by Barthold, a famous Russian Orientalist, late 19th, early 20th century, who says, "It's time for Russia to stop learning about the East from bad European books. It's time to start learning from the East directly." We can also hear something of this frustration with what's supposedly a separate and nefarious European influence in the tensions that we know were a very prominent part of the formation of the Russian Geographical Society, which went on to have huge influence on the representation of Asian lands within the broader Russian establishment, including, of course, government circles. There were pitched battles between the Europeans, or rather highly Russianized Germans, that had prominent places within the society, and by comparison, even though the analogy isn't one that they would like, young Turks who were in fact ethnic Russians, who insisted that they were better positioned to serve the purpose of studying the Russian people, even though all of them, almost without exception, also had impressive exposure to studying broader imperial communities. How fair is it, I guess I'd say, to accept this tension between European knowledge on the one hand and the need for a more Russian direct engagement with Asia on the other? In one regard, Bichurin seems to sort of affirm the reality of this tension and the specialness of the special value of Russian direct engagement with Asia, because from the very early 18th century, when we might, for our purposes anyway, start to identify the beginnings of a more systematic approach to gathering knowledge about Asia for a small Russian public and the Russian government, until Bichurin's time in the early to mid 19th century, Russian knowledge of Asia was overwhelmingly premised on an engagement with European literature, and the work of Russian expeditionaries often included prominent Europeans whose contributions were oriented towards a broader European-based republic of letters the Russians were participating in, but that was ultimately profoundly influencing the way the Russians understood an Asia that, to them anyway, was closer, but still ultimately shaped in many respects by European presumptions. And then Bichurin comes along, and he represents an example of the insistence on direct engagement, extensive stay in Beijing within the offices of the Russian Church, a commitment to learning languages, and then to interpreting the country and its civilization on its own terms. He is actually held up by historians and broader observers writing in a more exclusivist Russian vein as an example of the merits of a more explicit Russian engagement with Asia that supposedly bypasses European influence. But if we look at his story with more attention to the ambiguities of his role, we can see a lot more going on. European knowledge was never disconnected from Bichurin's understanding of China. His impression of the country was filtered through his very profound Europeanization through Russian institutions like the Kazan Spiritual Academy, or for that matter, the spiritual mission in Beijing itself, which for all of its Russianness was clearly modeled on other foreign missions. And his engagement with Europe as a scholar was an important part of his identity and influence. Bichurin was held up by European honors, and his reputation was secured by correspondence with European scholars. So, for all that he seems to speak to the specialness of a Russian position vis-a-vis Asia, which allows for a certain different quality of Asian knowledge, I think it would be a mistake to take Europe out of the picture. In fact, this ongoing, irresolvable, countervailing pressure between European leanings on one hand and interests in Asia on the other are very much a part of Bichurin's experience, and I think a broader Russian reality. He also, I think, tells us about this other tension between official and lived knowledge. They were supposed to be separate. The official knowledge was supposed to be the product of, a certain rarefied reflection, empirical study, sanctioned by institutions of imperial pedigree. The right kinds of people were involved in official knowledge, people of education and of social standing. Lived knowledge was something apart. I mean, it might be the colorful stuff of a travelogue, but it wasn't necessarily supposed to rival this deeper, supposedly more substantial official knowledge. But in fact, these knowledges were never this separate. And this is another thing that I think, bearing this in mind, will just make all the work that we do all the richer. Our papers, even today, have begun to show that different realms of knowledge intersect, and they certainly do in Bichurin's life. So he arrives in Beijing and devotes himself to the formal study of Chinese, and of course, deep familiarization with cardinal Chinese texts. But he is also engaged in a broader sort of ethnographic encounter with China, which lands him in a certain amount of trouble because he doesn't stay confined to the mission. In fact, he spends a good deal of time with small groups of Chinese converts in villages beyond the city. And this broader encounter with the lived world of his China definitely informs the way he ultimately establishes his scholarly reputation as an interpreter of the country for Russia. And we also see the combination of official and lived knowledge in the other great sort of undertaking of his academic slash managerial career or director's career. His engagement with the challenge of creating a Chinese language school in Kyakhta. There are no nobles in Kyakhta. There's no official history of civilization to be written there, I would say in a formal sense. The business of Kyakhta is business. It's trading and ensuring the good functioning of this gateway between the empires. The people who need to learn Chinese are the people who are going to serve the well-functioning of the border and the fluid movement of trade. They're Russian merchant boys and also Buryat boys living in a sort of nexus of knowledge of China or of this Sino-Russian frontier world that is not in the least bit academic, but is obviously completely essential to the academic enterprise of knowing China. And Bichurin's in the middle of this operation. So he too is reminding us of the way in which official and lived knowledges are never really separate. Okay, so having covered those questions, let me try and sum up by getting at this last question that I think should preoccupy us a little bit. We know there was knowledge. There were many forms of learning. Was there understanding? That invites a question not just about what learning is or knowledge is, which we haven't resolved yet, but what understanding might be, which I imagine is even more difficult to define. But he does his case does make us think about these two categories: learning on the one hand, understanding on the other, and whether they actually match up. It seems very hard to question the level of Bichurin's learning in regards to China for the standards of his day. It was exceptional and was regarded as such by his peers. But one does wonder, reading his works, reading his own reflections, including his correspondence, how much he understood China. What's valuable about this question is because it goes right to the heart of one of the great conceits of modern Russian national identity that has a place in scholarship, but also it's sort of alive on the land. And that's that the Russians have a special position vis-a-vis Asia, Asian societies, that they're privileged with because of the proximity of their culture and a history of cohabitation. They're privileged with a way of understanding Asia and a way of getting along with Asian peoples that separates them from other Europeans. Incredibly powerful motif that is especially alive in the last sort of imperialist surge of the Tsarist era in the Far East. Bichurin, in his opus of scholarship, in some respects, sort of speaks to this. I mean, he's a remarkable relativist. He's eerily reminiscent of well-intending, broad-minded people in the way that he sets up his understanding of China vis-a-vis his own society, because it's very clear in his writings that he is positioning himself as an interlocutor, as someone who is explaining China on the basis of Chinese materials and his lived Chinese experience to his countrymen, and beyond them, obviously, to Europeans as well. In the introduction to one of his most well-regarded works, which is called A Statistical Description of the Chinese Empire, he actually begins with a relativist credo, in which he reminds the Russians that they assume that the Chinese have everything wrong. But he's quick to show them, in this preface, his Russian readers, that is, that the Chinese live just as Russians do. It's just that in each case they have inverted sort of systems of making sense of the world, but eerily they're the same. So in other words, he's exploring relativism by acknowledging difference, but ultimately ending up with commonality. By the same token, it's very clear that relativism didn't stop the larger processes of Russian arrogance and prejudice in Bichurin's time. We know that Bichurin was read by the men that confidently embarked on the Amur expedition, and that within just a few years of his death claimed enormous territories within China for the Russian Empire, presuming within that dynamic that obviously the Russian state would be a better manager of those lands and was entitled to them in a profound sense. And there's another, there's a sense in Bichurin that he knew that his relativism, broadly speaking, was of little, how would I put it, little import to his readers. He writes, and this is perhaps a very telling quote, in 1844 to the historian Matteo Bakugan, that he's just completed his latest work on the civil and moral condition of China. He's flush with the victory that all scholars feel when they're finally done with their work. But he's already conceding to the irony of his position, which I'm sure all of us would acknowledge on some level, about how our work will be read. He says he's completed this opus, but he confides to Bakugan, but I don't know what to do with it. He says, Goria at Uma, woe from wit. It seems that our very highly placed academy or academic readers, they don't want any of this kind of thing. All they want are Chinese fairy tales so that they can fall asleep after playing a round of cards. And there's a reminder of the way in which this frontline relativism, that I think is indeed one of the stories of the lived experience of Russians in Asia, many Russians anyway, is sort of confirmed by another literary vignette, which I'll just share to conclude my remarks, not by Pushkin, but by Goncharov, who's the author of famous Oblomov. Now, in his time, before he became famous for Oblomov, he was famous for this round-the-world voyage on the frigate Pallada, that included stops in, for example, Japan. And that work, it's delightful to read, even at a century and a half of remove. It's really a wonderful piece of literature. It's also informed by a profoundly relativistic view of these societies, trying to make sense of them on their own terms and challenging Russian presumptions of superiority and certainly of judgment from a distance. But at the same time, or rather shortly thereafter, when Goncharov needs to make a point about who the Russians are in his great novel, Oblomov, he invents two rich, but in a very basic sense, stock characters. On the one hand, there's his Stulz, his Russian German, who is exquisitely dressed, pressed, top to bottom, highly efficient, practical, and successful. And then there's Oblomov, who insists that he's not sleeping, he's thinking, and almost rarely gets up, and almost rarely changes out of his garb, which is a Persian gown. And it's clear that even a highly relative writer and thinker and creator like Goncharov could still seize and use and live within powerful Orientalist stereotypes of Asian cultures, and that both of these things constantly coexisted, which seems to keep alive this question of how much was learned and whether the most important things from that learning were actually understood. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.